So if you're a first generation wealth builder, I want you to tap in. Tap in, because wealth building for the first generation person is not easy. It is thankless. It is hard. It is daunting. It is threatening to take your life from you, but you don't have to give in because you are in good company. I want to provide some encouragement to first generational wealth builders, those people who feel like God has positioned them in their family to partner with God to help deliver them from financial ruin. And the reason why I say put them in their family is because every family has a deliverer. Just think about Moses. Moses was born into a family and he became that deliverer, right? And so every family has a deliverer, but whenever that deliverer does not do their part, the burden falls to the next generation and it gets heavier and so forth and heavier and so forth. And so if you're feeling the burden of building wealth, if you're feeling the weight of being that deliverer of your lineage, then this video is for you. I want to give you some encouragement. So please go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and share this with a friend if you feel like I've said something of importance. Hey y'all, and welcome back to another installment of Recession Millionaires. I am Dr. Brianna Whiteside, and on Recession Millionaires, we talk about positioning ourselves to take advantage of the economic downturn. As I said in the introduction, I want to give encouragement to the first generation wealth builders, and I want to talk about first generation wealth builders from the Bible and ultimately how they went ahead and broke cycles and built legacies. Because we know that the Bible is a blueprint. Whatever you're prepared to look for, you can find in the Bible. And because I am so interested in building wealth and also bringing people along with me, I went ahead and kind of looked through the Bible to see if we had any first generational wealth builders, and we do. Y'all, sometimes when we read the Bible, we often assume that wealth in the Bible was always generational, but that's just not true. Ultimately, some wealth was not passed down, inherited, or even given. So the truth is that many people who God used the most powerfully in the Bible, they started from the bottom. They started with nothing, but they still were able to build the system and operate in wealth like God had originally wanted them to do. But ultimately, they had to pay the price. So I want you to understand, if you have no financial foundation, if you have no legacy to build on, if you have no people directly cheering you on, you are not alone. Because the Bible shows us that through faith, with instruction, so many people in the Bible found the courage to build anyway. And that is what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to find the courage to build anyway. So this teaching is for the first generation builder. It's for the one who sometimes cries themselves to sleep at night, like me. It's for the one who's breaking cycles instead of benefiting from them. It's for the one who's asking God for vision and strategy because you didn't inherit a financial model. Instead, you are creating one. So let's look at some of the most powerful first generation wealth builders in the Bible and what their stories reveal about building in faith during economic declines and even after failure. So the first person I want you to think about is Joseph, who we love to talk about. And we see in the story of Joseph that he built from strategy in a foreign system. So while Joseph was in the family business, y'all, he was low on the totem pole. The reason why I mentioned that he was low on a totem pole because he wasn't an executive in the business like his brothers were. He wasn't privy to a lot of financial decisions and mobility, but he was in the system and he was able to learn some things, which ultimately did position him later on and worked out for his good. But as a result of him being so low on the totem pole, we kind of see that Joseph didn't really start with a financial plan. Instead, he started with betrayal from his family. So that is a rough place to start your life from family betrayal. No one wants to go through that. But the Bible tells us that his brothers did sell him into slavery, which ultimately landed him in Potiphar's house. Now, this was a slight upgrade. Joseph goes from managing the sheep, being an employee, to managing Potiphar's entire estate, right? So he was incrementally upgraded, but we already know that didn't last long. Why? Because Potiphar's wife lied on him and he was imprisoned for a crime that he did not commit. So while he was rising to the next level, he got knocked down metaphorically in some other levels, right? Because he was imprisoned. He was stripped from everything again. And, that's a tough thing to kind of reconcile with. And we speed through this story like, oh my God, he went from the pit to the palace. No, he didn't. He did not. There was, I think, a 13-year incremental time frames that had to happen for him to get there. So he didn't just go from the pit to the palace, because we see that he went from his family business to Potiphar's house to prison. But in prison, he was again elevated and put over the region's prison. So he was, kind of in command in the prison. Again, he had a position of leadership, though he wasn't in the situation that he wanted to be in. But while he was a prisoner, he was still in charge. However, he still didn't have the connections that he needed to lift himself out of that condition. So sometimes you do just need the connections. You need the connections. And we know that as a result of him not necessarily having the connections, the Bible says that people whom he helped ultimately forgot about him. So yes, the situation was not the best. Yes, he may have wished for a different outcome, but he made the most out of his time in every season. And that is something that you're going to have to do if you hope to get everything that you're supposed to have. Not only was he betrayed by his family, not only was he lied on and in prison as a result of Potiphar's house, people forgot about him, even though he were doing good deeds for them. The Bible tells us that when Pharaoh had the dream that no one could interpret, Joseph's gift and all he had positioned himself to do in prison made room for him. Someone ultimately remembered Joseph in Pharaoh's time of need. And to be clear, Pharaoh was the one who had the power to change Joseph's life for good. And so when Joseph eventually stands before Pharaoh, after he's telling people, don't forget about me, after he's trying to do his best, but kind of keeps getting knocked down and, discouraged, he's finally standing before Pharaoh, and he's able to do more than Pharaoh needs. Why? Because Joseph had a lot of skills that Pharaoh would have needed. Now, Pharaoh just thought he needed his dream interpreted. However, Joseph was able to create a national economic strategy that preserved Egypt during a 7-year famine. And why is this important? Because you know how we like to say that God won't waste anything and everything is working for your good. Joseph went from management positions in every season, though they weren't the most ideal seasons. He was in management positions when he went to Potiphar's house. When he was in the prison, he was still in leadership positions. So when it was time for him to stand before Pharaoh, he not only did what Pharaoh needed him to do, but he was able to give him a future guidance, right? A forward-looking guidance on the economy and what he should be doing. And as a result, in Genesis 41, verse 39 through 40, Pharaoh ultimately says, since God has made all this known to you, you shall be in charge of my palace. So we see then that, Joseph didn't inherit wealth. And although his family had it because they had wealth through their animal and their livestock, it was stolen from him. But what he was able to do was steward crisis. Yes, these things happened to him in the past, but if Joseph had stayed married to the effects of that, he would not have been in position to steward the crisis, which was a bigger national crisis, which allowed him to rise as second in command in Egypt. And in return for his ability to steward crisis, he was promoted to the manager of the most powerful economy of his time. So what is your lesson here? Your lesson is that you don't have to own the system to out-strategize it. You don't have to own the system to out-strategize it, because sometimes wealth follows the one with the clearest plan in the most uncertain times. The second person I want to put on your radar is Ruth, who found favor at the edges, in the fringes, in the margins of society. So if we read the story of Ruth closely, we see that she had every reason to retreat, right? She had every reason not to follow Naomi. She was widowed. She had left her homeland, which was her place of comfort. And she had no husband, therefore no protection, therefore no inheritance. And yet the Bible tells you that she followed favor into the unfamiliar. So one thing, friends, we have to keep in mind is that the land of the unfamiliar is the realm of possibility. And we've heard this time and time again, that great things rarely happen in your comfort zones. So while Ruth left the comfort of her city, she was stepping into the realm of opportunity. So one of the things that we see Ruth do as she leaves the comfort of her hometown and goes into an unknown land is that she is willing to work in the margins. She is willing to work on the fringes of society. She is literally gleaning from the edges of Boaz's field. Ruth 2 and 3 says that so she went out and gleaned in the field after the reapers. She was gleaning after people who had taken their choice places. They gotten the best of it, and she was gleaning after them. And the thing that I find most fascinating about this verse is that Ruth refused to wait for favor to find her. So ultimately, what this means is that she refused to wait for better conditions or even wait on a sign from God. Instead, she did what she could do, and favor found her working. So the Bible tells us that, yes, she eventually married Boaz and became of the royal lineage of David and even of Jesus. And we love to cheer her on for that. We love that. But your lesson from this story is that first generational wealth is often built in the fields that other people overlook. It's not what everybody is doing. Sometimes it's what people are not doing. And so if you're willing to kind of glean and serve and work in those small places that may seem obscure or non-profitable, God will invite you into legacy, and you have to remember that. The third person I want to talk about is David, who we see amassed wealth from worship. So the Bible is clear that David wasn't trained in politics or palace affairs. He was a shepherd who was often underestimated and forgotten, and this is even by his father. So sure, he might have suffered from being outcast or even rejection, which is understandable. Could you imagine by being disowned or ashamed of by your parent? So yes, he kind of struggled with those things in humanity. But even in his personal struggle and potential identity crisis, his heart for God positioned him for kingship. So the Bible names many kings who won battles and were known for their greatness. But we see something unique with David. We see that he built wealth through warfare and stewardship. Not just warfare, but warfare and stewardship. And by the end of his reign, the Bible tells us that David had stored up enough resources for his son Solomon to build the temple. First Chronicles 29 and 2, and this is David saying, with all my resources, I have provided for the temple of my God. So your lesson from David's story is that you don't have to start with influence to build legacy. God trusts worshipers with wealth. And why? Because they know how to keep their hands open. If you've heard the people say it in church, if he could get it what? Through you, he'll give it to you. You have to keep your hands open and allow you to be a conduit for wealth. The fourth person that I want to remind you of is Noah. And y'all know I've been on a Noah kick, but Noah stepped into dominion after disaster. And the reason I find his story so important is because we are threatening economic disaster, but there is an after this. And if you position yourself wisely, you can step into dominion. So we know that Noah built before anyone understood what rain was. And while God knew that Noah had no reference point for rain, that was the least of his concerns. So what were his concerns? The dimensions and the instructions. God needed to get Noah the dimensions and the instructions so that when the storm came, Noah would be ultimately safe. However, safety wasn't the only thing attached to Noah's obedience. What else was attached to Noah's obedience? And I've said this before, and I'm just going to go ahead and list it. When the waters receded, Noah had all the remaining livestock. He had the only human workforce. He had open access to unclaimed land, and he had a covenant from God to rebuild. In Genesis 9 and 1, God tells Noah the same thing he's told the spirit of man in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So we see here then that Noah didn't inherit wealth. He inherited responsibility, and from obedience, wealth followed. So your lesson is that your obedience today can position you for ownership tomorrow, especially when everyone has to rebuild, okay? And that is the season after this season. And the last person I want to talk to you about is the father of our faith, Father Abraham, who had to trust the covenant over comfort. He had to trust the covenant between him and God over his own comfort. The Bible tells us that Abraham left everything that he knew, including his land, his culture, his security, and his father's house for a promise he could not see. Has God ever enticed you away from something with a promise? I know my career, that's what that promise was if I left, and there was an enticing period that happened. But it's a promise that I still haven't seen yet. But the idea of it is what gave me the strength and the courage and the will to actually leave what was familiar. So in Genesis 12:1, God tells Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you. So, where was Abraham's inheritance? Where was his roadmap? He didn't have these things because he just needed to start moving. And so many of you need to do just that. You need to start moving. But if we flip over to Genesis 13:2, we see that within a generation, Abraham became very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. Again, this is Genesis 13:2. But more importantly, he became the father of a legacy of faith and generational wealth that still speaks today. What is your lesson here? Your lesson is that obedience may feel like sacrifice in the moment, but it activates generational covenant. Okay? So if you are the first person in your family to build wealth like me, the first person to break the cycle, the first person to choose stewardship over survival, I want you to know that you are not alone and you are in good company. We see from the above examples that God has always used first generation builders to establish something new. And it wasn't that they were the most resourced either. They were not. It was because they were the most responsive. Are you going to respond? If you can respond and you have the ability and the capacity to respond, God will use you. So your obedience, your clarity, your structure, and even your strategy, it's not always about you. And I know it feels personal because you are taking all the hits, but it's ultimately about what comes through you. So I want you to know, because I know when I do these wealth chats and I talk about money and finances, people want to tell me that I'm teaching a prosperity gospel. I'm doing all these things. I'm just talking about stuff that's not overly spoken about. And the fascinating thing is that I'm not asking you for your money. Did I ask you to sow anything? Did I ask you to give anything? So why does wealth offend Christians? Cut it out. You need it. Okay. So I want you to know that if you are focusing on financial building, you're not less spiritual because you're paying attention to money. You're not worldly because you want to break free from cycles of financial bondage. You're becoming what your bloodline didn't hand you, and that is noble. Ultimately, friends, I want you to know that what you're doing right now is that you're building for legacy. So if this teaching has resonated with you, I want you to do three things. Number one, I want you to watch the entire playlist of Recession Millionaires. I'm dropping videos every day. Because the reason why I want you to watch it is because you are a cycle breaker. And you can break the cycles in shaky economies. As a matter of fact, shaky economies are ultimately setups. Number two, I want you to grab your Wealth Mastery Bundle equipped with 2 ebooks, How I Climbed Out of Consumer Debt in 8 Months and How You Can Too, and How I Saved $20,000 in 1 year and How You Can Too. The link is in the description. These are 2 ebooks. These are the strategies that I use to get out of consumer debt the first time and how what I'm using to build wealth this time. And lastly, I want you to book your one-on-one strategy session with me if you need help strategizing for the future. That is my strong suit. That is what I do the best. And that is what will ultimately shorten your distance between where you are and where you want to be. Friend, this is your building season. Let's make sure that the structure matches the size of the promise. I'll see you in the next episode of Recession Millionaires. Until then, bye.